What if the very faith meant to unite people was twisted to justify oppression? Welcome to Sands of History, where we unearth the complex and often uncomfortable truths of the past. In this deep dive, we explore the intricate relationship between Christianity and colonialism in South Africa, tracing the roots of apartheid to theological justifications, land dispossession, and the eventual rise of liberation theology as a beacon of resistance. If you find this journey into history enlightening, please like, share, and subscribe to support our mission of uncovering the past. You can also help us financially through the links in the description to keep these stories alive. The historical context. Christianity's arrival in South Africa. Christianity arrived in South Africa with European settlers in the 17th century, primarily through the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1652. The Cape Colony, established as a refreshment station for Dutch ships, became the first foothold for European influence in the region. With the settlers came the Dutch Reformed Church, DRC, a Calvinist institution that would profoundly shape South Africa's social, political, and racial landscape. The DRC was not merely a religious body. It was a cultural and ideological force that intertwined with colonial ambitions. As settlers expanded their control over land and resources, Christianity became a tool to legitimize their dominance over indigenous populations, including the Khoikhoi, San, and later the Xhosa and Zulu. The seeds of apartheid, a system of racial segregation formalized in the 20th century, were sown in these early colonial encounters, where theology and power became uneasy bedfellows. The Dutch Reformed Churches. Theological justification for apartheid. The Dutch Reformed Church played a pivotal role in providing a theological framework for racial segregation, which later crystallized into apartheid. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the DRC developed a doctrine that interpreted biblical texts to justify racial hierarchy. This theology was rooted in a particular reading of Calvinism, emphasizing predestination and the idea of a chosen people. The curse of Ham and racial hierarchy, one of the most notorious theological justifications, was the misuse of the biblical story of Noah's curse on Ham's descendants. Genesis chapter 9, 20-27. DRC theologians interpreted this passage to suggest that black Africans were divinely ordained to serve Europeans, who saw themselves as the descendants of Noah's favored sons. This interpretation conveniently aligned with colonial interests, portraying racial segregation as part of God's plan. By the 20th century, as apartheid was formalized under the National Party's rule in 1948, the DRC's theology evolved into what was termed Christian nationalism. This ideology framed Afrikaners as a divinely chosen people, tasked with preserving their culture and dominance over South Africa's diverse populations. The DRC argued that racial separation was necessary to maintain social order and prevent cultural mixing, which they deemed sinful. Apartheid as a moral imperative, the DRC's 1948 report, Human Relations in the Light of Scripture, explicitly endorsed apartheid, claiming that racial segregation was biblically sanctioned. The church argued that God had created distinct races for a reason, and integration would disrupt the divine order. This theological stance was not only preached from pulpits, but also institutionalized through education, marriage laws, and spatial segregation. Apartheid as a moral imperative. The DRC's 1948 report, Human Relations in the Light of Scripture, explicitly endorsed apartheid, claiming that racial segregation was biblically sanctioned. The church argued that God had created distinct races for a reason, and integration would disrupt the divine order. This theological stance was not only preached from pulpits, but also institutionalized through education, marriage laws, and spatial segregation. For example, the DRC supported the Group Areas Act, 1950, which forcibly separated racial groups into designated living areas. Pastors often preached that these policies protected the purity of Afrikaner identity, reinforcing the notion that black South Africans were inherently inferior and destined for servitude. This theological justification provided moral cover for the brutal realities of apartheid, including forced removals, pass laws, and systemic disenfranchisement. Mission stations and land dispossession. While the DRC shaped the ideological underpinnings of racial segregation, mission stations established by various Christian denominations played a complex role in colonialism and land dispossession. From the late 18th century, European missionaries, Lutherans, Moravians, and later Anglicans and Methodists set up stations across South Africa to convert indigenous populations. These stations, while often presented as benevolent efforts to civilize and Christianize, were deeply entangled with colonial expansion. Mission stations as tools of control. Mission stations such as those established by the London Missionary Society, e.g. Bethelsdorp and Kuruman, were often located on or near indigenous lands. Missionaries offered education, healthcare, and religious instruction, but these services came at a cost. Indigenous communities were pressured to abandon their traditional practices, languages, and social structures in favor of European Christian norms. This cultural erosion weakened indigenous resistance to colonial encroachment. Moreover, mission stations facilitated land dispossession. Missionaries often acted as intermediaries between colonial authorities and indigenous groups, negotiating land deals that favored settlers. For instance, the Moravian mission at Gnadendal, established in 1738, initially provided refuge for displaced Khoikhoi, but later became a site where labor was extracted for colonial enterprises. Missionaries, wittingly or unwittingly, helped map and control territories, paving the way for settler land grabs. The role of education and assimilation. Mission schools were another mechanism of colonial control. They taught Christian doctrine alongside European languages and values, preparing indigenous people for subservient roles in the colonial economy, such as laborers or domestic workers. While some missionaries, like John Philip of the London Missionary Society, advocated for indigenous rights, their efforts were often overshadowed by the broader colonial agenda. By the 19th century, mission stations had become integral to the colonial project, transforming indigenous landscapes into spaces of European dominance. The legacy of mission stations is evident in the loss of ancestral lands for groups like the Xhosa and Zulu. For example, the establishment of mission stations in the Eastern Cape during the 19th century coincided with the frontier wars, where British and Boer forces seized vast tracts of land. Christianity, in this context, was not just a faith but a tool of empire, reshaping South Africa's geography and social fabric. The global impact. South African liberation theology had a global reach, influencing movements in other parts of Africa and the diaspora. The World Council of Churches, through its program to combat racism, provided financial and moral support to anti-apartheid activists, amplifying the voices of South African theologians. This global solidarity helped pressure the apartheid government, contributing to its eventual collapse in 1994. Conclusion. A call to reflect and act. The story of Christianity and colonialism in South Africa reminds us that faith can be both a tool of oppression and a force for liberation. The Dutch Reformed Church's theological justifications for apartheid, the role of mission stations in land dispossession, and the rise of liberation theology as resistance highlight the power of ideas to shape history. As we reflect on this past, we are challenged to consider how belief systems continue to influence justice and equality today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Sands of History, where we uncover the stories that shaped our world. If this exploration resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to support our mission. You can also help us financially through the links in the description to ensure we can continue bringing these stories to light. Together, let's keep history alive and learn from its lessons.